The morning sun cast long shadows across the Veterans Memorial Park as Sarah Martinez adjusted her worn baseball cap, pulling it low over her eyes. At 32, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that spoke of battles fought and survived, though most people who passed her on the street would never guess the depths of her story. Her hands, calloused from years of manual labor since returning from overseas, gripped the handles of her cleaning cart as she made her way toward the community center. Sarah had been working as a janitor at the Riverside Community Center for 2 years now. It wasn't the life she had imagined when she was younger, but it was honest work, and it helped her pay for the small apartment she shared with her 8-year-old daughter, Emma. The community center was busy that morning, bustling with preparations for the annual Veterans Day celebration that would take place later that evening. As Sarah pushed her cart down the hallway, she could hear voices from the main conference room where the event organizers were meeting. Through the partially open door, she caught glimpses of well-dressed men and women sitting around a polished table, discussing the evening's program. Among them sat Councilman Richard Hayes, a pompous man in his 50s who had made a career out of political grandstanding and had never served a day in the military himself. Sarah had encountered Hayes before, and each interaction left her feeling smaller and more invisible. He had a way of looking through people like her, as if their existence was merely an inconvenience in his perfectly ordered world. She had learned to keep her head down when he was around, focusing on her work and trying to remain unnoticed. But today would be different. Today, her carefully maintained invisibility would be shattered in the most humiliating way possible. As Sarah quietly entered the conference room to empty the trash bins, Councilman Hayes was in the middle of a passionate speech about honoring veterans. His voice boomed across the room as he gestured dramatically, completely unaware of her presence as she worked around the edges of the room. "We must never forget the brave men and women who have served our country," Hayes proclaimed, his chest puffed with false pride. "Those heroes who have sacrificed everything for our freedom deserve our utmost respect and recognition. We cannot allow their service to be diminished by those who would claim glory they haven't earned." Sarah's jaw tightened as she listened to his words. She had heard similar speeches before, usually from people who had never worn a uniform or heard the whistle of incoming artillery. But she continued her work silently, knowing that speaking up would only cause trouble she couldn't afford. It was then that Margaret Winters, the sharp-tongued wife of a local businessman, noticed Sarah moving quietly around the room. Margaret had always resented having the help present during important meetings, and Hayes's speech about veterans had sparked an idea in her vindictive mind. "Excuse me," Margaret said loudly, her voice cutting through Hayes' speech and drawing everyone's attention to Sarah. "I think it's inappropriate to have someone like her cleaning while we're discussing such an important topic. How do we know she's not listening in on our private conversations?" Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks as all eyes turned to her. She kept her head down, hoping to finish her task quickly and escape the room. But Margaret wasn't finished. "You know, Richard," Margaret continued, her voice dripping with false concern, "with all this talk about honoring real veterans, we should be careful about who we allow around us. I've heard rumors about people pretending to be veterans to gain sympathy or benefits. How do we know our cleaning lady here isn't one of those stolen valor cases?" The room fell silent except for the sound of Sarah's heart pounding in her ears. She could feel the weight of everyone's stares as Margaret's words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Sarah had faced enemy fire, had watched friends die, had carried the weight of impossible decisions, but nothing had prepared her for this moment of public humiliation. Councilman Hayes, sensing an opportunity to demonstrate his supposed commitment to veterans' rights, stood up and addressed Sarah directly. "Ma'am," he said in a condescending tone that made her skin crawl, "Mrs. Winters raises a valid concern. With all the cases of stolen valor we've seen recently, we have to be vigilant about protecting the honor of our true veterans." Sarah finally lifted her head, her dark eyes meeting Hayes with a steady gaze that should have warned him to tread carefully. But the councilman was too caught up in his performance to notice the steel in her expression. "I'm not accusing you of anything," Hayes continued, his voice growing louder as he warmed to his audience. "But since we're planning an event to honor our veterans, it would be irresponsible of us not to verify that everyone here has the right to be in the presence of such sacred planning." The other committee members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked embarrassed by the turn the conversation had taken, but none spoke up to stop what was happening. Sarah stood frozen, her cleaning supplies forgotten, as she realized that her quiet life was about to be torn apart by these people who knew nothing about her or what she had endured. Margaret sensed blood in the water and pressed her attack. "She's probably never even been overseas," she said with a cruel laugh. "Look at her. Does she look like someone who could handle military service?" The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Each accusation was a betrayal of every sleepless night, every flashback, every moment she had struggled to readjust to civilian life, while carrying wounds that no one could see. Her hands began to tremble, not from fear, but from the rage building inside her chest. Hayes, emboldened by Margaret's support and the attention of the room, decided to escalate the situation. "You know what? I think we should clear this up right now. Ma'am, have you ever served in the military?" Sarah's voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. "Yes, sir. I served in Afghanistan." "Really?" Hayes said with obvious skepticism. "What unit? What was your role? When did you serve?" The questions came rapid fire, each one designed to catch her in a lie that Hayes was convinced she was telling. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that signaled the beginning of a panic attack. But she forced herself to breathe steadily and answer his questions. "I served with the 10th Mountain Division," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I was a combat medic. I did 3 tours between 2010 and 2015. Margaret let out a dismissive snort. "A combat medic? Please. Women weren't even allowed in combat roles then. You're not even good at lying." Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides. Margaret's ignorance about women's roles in the military was infuriating, but not surprising. Like many civilians, she had no understanding of how women had served in combat zones long before official policies changed. "Ma'am," Sarah said, her voice now steady and clear. "With respect, women have been serving in combat roles for years, regardless of official policy. When the bullets start flying, there's no safe area. Everyone fights." Hayes waved his hand dismissively. "Even if that's true, how do we know you're telling the truth about any of this? Anyone can memorize unit names and make up stories. Where's your proof?" The room had gone completely silent now. With everyone watching the confrontation unfold, Sarah could see the hunger in their eyes, the way they seemed to feed off the drama and conflict. These were people who lived comfortable lives, insulated from real hardship. And they were treating her pain like entertainment. "I don't carry my military records with me to work," Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice level. "But I can assure you that my service is well documented." "Well, that's convenient," Margaret said with a smirk. "No proof. Just stories. How many other fake veterans are out there taking jobs away from honest, hard-working Americans?" The accusation was too much. Sarah felt something break inside her chest, a dam that had been holding back years of suppressed pain and frustration. She had tried so hard to build a quiet life, to protect Emma from the chaos of her past, to find peace in simple work and small moments of happiness. But these people, these privileged, ignorant people, were determined to destroy even that modest sanctuary. "You want proof?" Sarah said, her voice now carrying an edge that made several committee members lean back in their chairs. "You really want proof of my service?" Before anyone could respond, Sarah reached for the bottom of her uniform shirt. Her hands moved to the buttons, and for a moment, the room held its collective breath, unsure of what was happening. "Ma'am, what are you doing?" Hayes asked, his voice cracking slightly as he sensed that he might have pushed too far. But Sarah was beyond caring about his comfort or the propriety of the situation. Years of humiliation, of being overlooked and dismissed, of having her service and sacrifice questioned by people who had never put their lives on the line for anything, had built to this moment. She unbuttoned her shirt and let it fall to the floor, standing in the conference room in just her undershirt. The room erupted in shocked murmurs and uncomfortable shifting. But Sarah wasn't finished. She grabbed the hem of her undershirt and pulled it over her head, exposing her back to the room. The gasps that followed were audible throughout the conference room. Sarah's back was a canvas of scar tissue and ink, telling a story that no amount of words could convey. Burn scars from an IED explosion crossed her shoulder blades, while shrapnel scars dotted her lower back, like a constellation of pain. But it was the tattoo that made the room fall completely silent. Covering most of her upper back was an intricate memorial tattoo. At the center was a combat medic symbol surrounded by names and dates. Below it, a detailed reproduction of a military medal hung from a ribbon that seemed to flow into other elements of the design. Dog tags with names and service dates were scattered throughout the piece, and at the bottom, in flowing script, were the words, "Until Valhalla," and "No one left behind." But the most shocking element of the tattoo was at the very top, near her neck. There, in detailed ink, was the distinctive star and ribbon of the Medal of Honor, with a date from Afghanistan and coordinates that any military person would recognize as a combat location. The room was so quiet that Sarah could hear her own breathing as she stood with her back to the committee, her scars and tattoos on full display. She could feel their stares, could sense their shock and growing understanding of just how badly they had misjudged her. Margaret was the first to find her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. Is that real?" Sarah slowly turned around, her eyes blazing with a mixture of pain and defiant pride. She looked directly at Councilman Hayes, who had gone pale and was staring at her with wide, horrified eyes. "The Medal of Honor tattoo commemorates the day I pulled 6 soldiers out of a burning vehicle after an IED attack," Sarah said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "I spent 14 hours performing field surgery under enemy fire, while calling in airstrikes on our own position to prevent capture. 3 of those soldiers died in my arms despite everything I did to save them. Their names are on my back because I carry them with me every day." She paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. "The other tattoos represent the 43 soldiers I treated during my 3 tours, including the 19 who didn't make it home. Every name, every date, every symbol on my body represents someone who bled and died while I tried to save them. So yes, Mrs. Winters, I have proof of my service. It's written in scars and ink on my body, and it will be there until the day I die." The silence that followed was deafening. Hayes had sunk back into his chair, his face a mask of horror and shame. Margaret looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. The other committee members sat frozen, unsure how to process what they had just witnessed. Sarah calmly picked up her shirts and began to get dressed again, her movements deliberate and controlled. "I've been working here for 2 years, she said as she buttoned her uniform shirt. "I've never asked for special treatment, never talked about my service, never sought recognition or praise. I just wanted to work, provide for my daughter, and live quietly. But apparently, that was too much to ask." As she finished dressing, Sarah looked around the room one final time. "You wanted to verify my right to be in the presence of your sacred planning? Well, now you know. I've earned my place at this table and every other table in this country. The question is, what have any of you done to earn yours?" She gathered her cleaning supplies and moved toward the door, but Hayes finally found his voice. "Wait," he called out, his tone completely changed from the arrogant condescension of before. "Please. We didn't know. I'm sorry. We're all sorry. This was a terrible mistake." Sarah paused at the door without turning around. "Yes, it was," she said quietly. "But not because you didn't know about my service. It was a mistake because you assumed you had the right to humiliate and judge someone based on their appearance and their job. You assumed that because I clean your floors and empty your trash, I must be less than you. That's the real problem here, Councilman Hayes, and an apology doesn't fix it." With that, Sarah walked out of the conference room, leaving behind a group of people who would never forget the lesson they had just learned. But her ordeal was far from over. Word of what had happened would spread quickly through the community center, and by the end of the day, the story would be all over town. As Sarah made her way down the hallway, she could hear the explosion of voices from the conference room behind her. Some were arguing, others were clearly distressed, and she caught fragments of heated conversations about what had just transpired. But she kept walking, focusing on the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other. She had survived worse than this, she reminded herself. She had survived combat, survivor's guilt, PTSD, the challenge of raising a daughter alone while dealing with her own trauma. She would survive this too, even though the cost of today's revelation would likely change everything about her carefully constructed quiet life. What Sarah didn't know was that her story was about to take another dramatic turn. Because at that very moment, a man was walking through the front doors of the community center. A man whose presence would transform her humiliation into something entirely different. A man whose own recognition of her tattoo would set in motion events that would change not just her life, but the lives of everyone who had witnessed her public exposure. General William Bull Morrison had arrived early for the evening's Veterans Day ceremony, hoping to review the preparations and meet with the organizing committee. He was a decorated career soldier who had spent 35 years in the Army, including multiple deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq. At 60 years old, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had seen the worst of war and the best of human courage, and who understood the true cost of the freedom that others took for granted. As he walked down the hallway toward the conference room, General Morrison had no idea that he was about to come face to face with a story that would shake him to his core, and that the woman he was about to encounter was someone whose sacrifice and heroism had become legendary in certain military circles. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose not just the truth about Sarah's service, but the depth of ignorance and prejudice that she had been quietly enduring for years. And when General Morrison saw her tattoo, when he recognized the significance of what was inked on her skin, the comfortable assumptions of everyone involved would be shattered forever. The morning had started like any other day for Sarah Martinez, but it would end with her life changed in ways she could never have imagined. The humiliation she had just endured was only the beginning of a story that would soon become the talk of the entire military community and would force everyone who had witnessed her exposure to confront their own assumptions about heroism, sacrifice, and what it truly means to serve one's country. General William Morrison had seen his share of difficult moments during his 3 decades of military service, but nothing had prepared him for the scene he encountered as he approached the conference room. The raised voices and heated arguments, filtering through the partially open door, made him pause, his instincts telling him that something significant was happening beyond simple event planning disagreements. As a career officer who had commanded troops in some of the most dangerous theaters of operation in the world, Morrison had developed an ability to read situations quickly and accurately. The tension in the voices he heard suggested conflict that went far beyond logistical concerns about the evening's Veterans Day ceremony. He was about to knock on the door when a woman emerged from the room, moving with the controlled, measured pace of someone trying to maintain composure under extreme stress. Morrison's trained eye immediately recognized something familiar in her bearing. Despite her civilian clothes and cleaning cart, she carried herself with a posture that spoke of military training and discipline. But it was when she turned slightly in the hallway light that Morrison felt his breath catch in his throat. For just a moment, as the woman adjusted her shirt collar, he caught a glimpse of something that made his pulse quicken. There, at the base of her neck, barely visible above the fabric of her uniform shirt, was the edge of what looked like a very specific and very significant tattoo. Morrison had seen that particular design only once before, but it was seared into his memory with the clarity that comes from witnessing extraordinary heroism under fire. His mind immediately flashed back to a briefing he had attended at the Pentagon 3 years earlier, where he had been shown photographs and video footage of one of the most remarkable acts of battlefield courage he had ever encountered. The woman was already disappearing around the corner when Morrison called out, "Ma'am, excuse me. Could I have a word?" Sarah stopped but didn't turn around immediately. Her shoulders tensed, and Morrison could see that she was fighting to maintain control. When she finally faced him, he was struck by the depth of pain in her eyes, but also by the unmistakable strength that lay beneath it. "General Morrison," she said quietly, reading his name tag and recognizing his rank insignia. Old habits died hard, and despite everything that had just happened, she automatically straightened her posture in the presence of a senior officer. Morrison studied her face carefully, comparing it to images he had seen years before in classified briefings. The woman in those photos had been younger, wearing combat gear and covered in dust and blood, but the bone structure was the same, and those eyes were unmistakable. I'm sorry to bother you, Morrison said gently. But I couldn't help noticing. Would you mind if I asked about your tattoo? The one at your neckline? Sarah's hand instinctively went to her collar, pressing it closer to her throat. The last thing she wanted after the humiliation she had just endured was to discuss her tattoos with yet another person who might question their authenticity or meaning. Sir, I'd rather not discuss it, she said, her voice carefully controlled. It's been a difficult morning, and I just want to finish my work and go home. But Morrison wasn't giving up that easily. Something about this woman's presence, combined with that glimpse of the tattoo, had triggered a recognition that sent chills down his spine. If his suspicions were correct, he was looking at someone whose story had become legendary in certain military circles, someone whose actions had saved lives, and whose sacrifice had earned the highest recognition his country could bestow. Ma'am, I understand your reluctance. But I think there's been a misunderstanding here. My name is General William Morrison, and I served multiple tours in Afghanistan. If that tattoo is what I think it is, then you and I need to talk. The authority in his voice, combined with the specific mention of Afghanistan, made Sarah look at him more carefully. She could see the combat ribbons on his dress uniform, including several that indicated extended service in theater. This wasn't some politician or civilian playing soldier. This was a career military officer who had seen real combat. Sir, what exactly do you think you saw? Sarah asked, her voice betraying the first hint of uncertainty she had shown. Morrison stepped closer, lowering his voice so their conversation wouldn't be overheard by the people still arguing in the conference room behind them. I think I saw the edge of a Medal of Honor memorial tattoo, and if I'm right, I think you're Sarah Martinez, formerly Sergeant First Class Martinez, 10th Mountain Division. The color drained from Sarah's face. It had been years since anyone had used her military rank and formal unit designation. She had worked so hard to blend into civilian life, to be invisible, to avoid the attention that came with her past. How do you know that name? She whispered, her composure finally beginning to crack. Morrison's expression softened with something that looked like reverence. Because your story was briefed to every general officer in the Army. What you did on Hill 394 inches the Kunar province was the stuff of legend. When I heard that Sergeant Martinez had quietly disappeared into civilian life after her discharge, I wondered if we'd ever hear from her again. Sarah felt her knees go weak. Hill 394. It had been 8 years since that day, but she still dreamed about it almost every night. The day that had earned her the Medal of Honor had also been the day that broke something inside her that had never quite healed. I don't know what you've heard, Sarah said, but Morrison raised his hand to stop her. I know exactly what happened, he said firmly. I was the one who recommended your citation go forward. I was the commanding general of Regional Command East when your convoy was ambushed. I monitored that entire engagement from the Tactical Operations Center. The hallway seemed to spin around Sarah as the implications of Morrison's words sank in. She had never known who had been responsible for pushing her medal recommendation through channels. In the chaos following her actions and the subsequent medical evacuation, she had lost track of the paperwork and politics that surrounded military decorations. You were watching? She asked, her voice barely audible. Morrison nodded grimly. Every minute of those 14 hours. We had drone coverage, radio intercepts. Everything. I watched you crawl back into that burning vehicle 6 times to pull out wounded soldiers. I listened to you call in airstrikes on your own position when the Taliban were about to overrun your location. I heard you performing surgery by radio guidance while taking enemy fire. The memories that Sarah had worked so hard to suppress came flooding back. The smell of burning diesel fuel and flesh. The weight of her friend Tommy Rodriguez as she dragged him from the wreckage of their Humvee. The feeling of hot blood on her hands as she tried to stop bleeding that wouldn't stop. The sound of incoming mortars mixing with the screams of wounded soldiers. General, I can't. I don't want to talk about this, Sarah said, but Morrison could see that she was wavering. What happened in that conference room? Morrison asked, his voice taking on the commanding tone of someone accustomed to getting answers. I heard shouting, and you came out looking like someone had just gutted you. Sarah's anger flared again as she remembered the humiliation she had just endured. Some people decided that I didn't look like their idea of a veteran. They accused me of stolen valor, demanded proof of my service. They said I was just making up stories to gain sympathy. Morrison's jaw tightened. He had encountered this attitude before. The ignorant assumption that heroism had to look a certain way, or come from certain types of people. It was one of the things that disgusted him most about civilian attitudes toward military service. "And what did you do?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I showed them my tattoos," Sarah said bitterly. "I took off my shirt in front of the entire committee and showed them my scars and my memorial ink. I told them about every name on my back, every soldier I lost. I made them look at the proof they demanded." Morrison felt a surge of anger on her behalf. The idea that this woman, who had earned the highest decoration for valor that America could bestow, had been forced to expose herself and her trauma to prove her worth to a group of ignorant civilians made his blood boil. "Who were these people?" he demanded. "City councilmen, committee members, people planning the Veterans Day ceremony, people who think they know what service looks like because they've seen it in movies." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, processing what he had learned. Then, without warning, he did something that shocked Sarah completely. The general, a man who commanded respect from some of the most powerful people in the military, came to attention and rendered a crisp, formal salute. "Sergeant Martinez," he said with absolute gravity, "it is an honor to meet you." Sarah stared at him in stunned silence. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had saluted her, let alone a general officer. The gesture was so unexpected, so completely at odds with the humiliation she had just experienced, that it nearly broke her composure entirely. "Sir, you don't need to," she began, but Morrison cut her off. "Yes, I do," he said firmly. "What those people did to you in there was unconscionable. But it also gives me an opportunity to correct a significant injustice." "What do you mean?" Morrison's expression grew serious. "Sarah, how much do you know about what happened after your actions on Hill 394? About how your story was received by the military community?" "Not much," Sarah admitted. "After I was evacuated and spent months in the hospital, things were chaos. I was dealing with my injuries, PTSD, trying to figure out how to rebuild my life. The medal ceremony was nice, but then everyone just seemed to forget and move on." "That's where you're wrong," Morrison said. "Nobody forgot. Your actions that day became required reading at the War College. Your tactical decisions are taught to combat medics in their advanced training. The way you coordinated air support while providing medical care under fire is studied by officers learning battlefield command." Sarah felt overwhelmed by this information. She had assumed that her story had been filed away and forgotten. Just another medal citation in a long war filled with acts of heroism. "But more than that," Morrison continued, "your service became a symbol of something important. When ignorant people talk about women in combat, when they question whether female soldiers can handle the pressure of battlefield conditions, we point to Sergeant Sarah Martinez. When politicians debate the value of medical training for combat troops, we tell them about Hill 394. Tears were beginning to form in Sarah's eyes, though she fought to hold them back. For years, she had felt forgotten and discarded, just another veteran struggling to find her place in civilian society. The idea that her service had meaning beyond that terrible day was almost too much to process. "The truth is," Morrison said, "you've been doing the military a disservice by hiding. There are thousands of young soldiers who could benefit from your example. From seeing that heroes come in all forms, and that service doesn't end when you take off the uniform." "General, I'm not a hero," Sarah said quietly. "I was just doing my job. I was a medic, and there were wounded soldiers. I did what I was trained to do, under conditions that would have broken most people," Morrison replied. "While taking enemy fire, with your own vehicle burning around you, with wounded soldiers depending on you for survival. You didn't just do your job, Sarah. You redefined what it means to serve under impossible circumstances." The sound of voices growing louder from the conference room reminded both of them that the situation they were discussing was far from over. Morrison looked toward the door with an expression that suggested he was formulating a plan. "I think it's time those people in there learned exactly who they just humiliated," Morrison said. Would you be willing to come back in with me? To let me introduce you properly? Sarah shook her head immediately. General, I can't go back in there. I can't face them again. Not after. You won't be facing them as a janitor who was forced to prove herself, Morrison said firmly. You'll be facing them as Medal of Honor recipient, Sergeant First Class, Sarah Martinez, accompanied by the general officer who witnessed your heroism firsthand. There's a difference. Sarah stood in the hallway, torn between the desire to hide from further humiliation and the growing realization that maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop running from her past. The general's presence had changed everything about the dynamics of the situation. But that didn't make the prospect of returning to face her accusers any less terrifying. What would you say to them? She asked finally. Morrison's expression grew hard. I would tell them the truth about what real service looks like. I would explain that they just subjected a genuine American hero to treatment that would be shameful under any circumstances, and I would make sure they understand the depth of their ignorance and the injustice of their actions. The hallway fell silent except for the sound of Sarah's breathing as she considered the general's proposal. Part of her wanted nothing more than to walk away, to go home to Emma and try to pretend this day had never happened. But another part of her, the part that had crawled back into a burning vehicle 6 times to save her fellow soldiers, was tired of hiding and running and apologizing for her existence. If I do this, Sarah said slowly, I want something in return. Name it. I want those people to understand that what they did today wasn't just wrong because of who I am or what I've done. It was wrong because they assumed they had the right to humiliate and judge someone based on their appearance and their job. I don't want an apology because I'm a Medal of Honor recipient. I want an apology because I'm a human being who deserved basic respect, regardless of my background. Morrison nodded approvingly. Agreed. But Sarah, there's something else you need to know before we go back in there. What? The Veterans Day ceremony tonight was supposed to feature a keynote speaker, but he had to cancel due to illness. The organizing committee has been scrambling to find a replacement. I think I just found the perfect person for the job. Sarah's eyes widened in alarm. General, I can't speak in public. I don't do that kind of thing. I'm not a speaker. You're a hero who has been hiding her light under a bushel for too long, Morrison said. But we'll discuss that later. Right now, let's go show those people what a real veteran looks like. With that, General Morrison turned toward the conference room door, his bearing radiating the kind of authority that comes from commanding troops in combat. Sarah hesitated for just a moment longer, then straightened her shoulders and followed him back toward the room where her humiliation had begun, not knowing that she was about to witness a confrontation that would become the stuff of local legend and would change the lives of everyone involved. General Morrison didn't bother to knock as he pushed open the conference room door. His entrance was the kind that immediately commanded attention. The bearing of a man accustomed to walking into rooms where life and death decisions were made daily. Behind him, Sarah followed with measured steps, her heart pounding but her head held high. The heated argument that had been raging since Sarah's departure came to an abrupt halt. Councilman Hayes, who had been gesticulating wildly while trying to manage the damage control, froze mid-sentence when he saw the general's uniform and the array of combat ribbons across his chest. Margaret Winters, who had been loudly defending her actions, suddenly found herself unable to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, Morrison said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. I believe introductions are in order. The committee members shifted nervously in their seats. Several had the good sense to look ashamed of what had transpired, while others, particularly Hayes and Margaret, wore expressions of defensive anger, mixed with growing apprehension. Morrison stepped aside, placing his hand respectfully on Sarah's shoulder. I would like you to meet Sergeant First Class Sarah Martinez, United States Army, recipient of the Medal of Honor, the Purple Heart, the Bronze Star with Valor Device, and the Combat Medical Badge. The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of papers rustling seemed thunderous. Hayes had gone pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Margaret looked as though she had been struck by lightning. That's impossible, Margaret whispered, but her voice lacked any conviction. Morrison's eyes fixed on her with the intensity of a laser sight. I'm sorry, ma'am. What exactly is impossible? That this woman served her country with distinction? That she earned the highest decoration for valor that America can bestow? Or that someone like her could exist without your knowledge or approval? Margaret shrank back in her chair, but Morrison wasn't finished with her. Let me tell you what's actually impossible, Mrs. Winters. What's impossible is that a group of people planning to honor veterans would subject a genuine war hero to the kind of humiliation I witnessed in this hallway. What's impossible is that you had the audacity to question this woman's service while having no understanding whatsoever of what real service looks like. Hayes finally found his voice, though it came out as a croak. General, we didn't know. If we had known about her background. Stop right there, Morrison commanded, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. Your problem isn't that you didn't know about Sergeant Martinez's background. Your problem is that you assumed someone in her position couldn't possibly be worthy of your respect. Morrison began to pace in front of the conference table like a prosecutor addressing a jury. Let me tell you about Hill 394, since you seem so concerned with verifying credentials. On March 15, 2017, Sergeant Martinez was part of a convoy moving through the Kunar province in Afghanistan, when her unit was ambushed by a numerically superior Taliban force. The committee members sat transfixed as Morrison's authoritative voice filled the room with details they had never imagined. The lead vehicle in the convoy hit an improvised explosive device, killing the driver instantly and trapping 5 soldiers in a vehicle that was rapidly filling with smoke and flames. The convoy was immediately surrounded and taking heavy fire from multiple directions. Sarah closed her eyes, the memories flooding back despite her efforts to keep them at bay. She could smell the acrid smoke again, could hear the screams of wounded soldiers mixing with the crack of incoming rounds. Morrison continued his account with military precision. While her fellow soldiers took defensive positions, Sergeant Martinez made the decision to advance toward the burning vehicle. Under direct enemy fire, with no regard for her own safety, she crawled through a gap in the twisted metal and began extracting wounded soldiers. But that's not what makes her story extraordinary, Morrison said, his voice growing quieter but more intense. What makes it extraordinary is that she had to make that crawl 6 separate times. 6 times she went back into that burning vehicle while Taliban fighters were trying to kill her. 6 times, she risked her own life to save soldiers who were trapped and helpless. Margaret had begun to cry quietly, her hands covering her face as the reality of what she had done began to sink in. The 3rd soldier she pulled out was dead, Morrison continued relentlessly. The 4th was unconscious and had lost so much blood that he was barely alive. The 5th soldier was awake and screaming, with both legs crushed and burns covering 30% of his body. And the 6th. Morrison paused, looking directly at Sarah. The 6th soldier was her best friend, a man she had served with for 2 years. He was conscious when she found him, trapped under debris with massive internal injuries. He begged her not to try to move him, told her to save herself. Do you know what Sergeant Martinez did? The room was so quiet that the sound of someone's breathing seemed loud. She stayed with him, while Taliban fighters moved closer to overrunning their position. While the vehicle burned around them, she performed field surgery using nothing but her combat medical kit and radio guidance from a surgeon 200 miles away. For 3 hours, she kept that soldier alive through procedures that most doctors wouldn't attempt in a fully equipped hospital. Hayes had put his head in his hands, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Morrison's voice grew harder. But the Taliban kept advancing, and it became clear that the convoy's position was about to be overrun. The tactical situation demanded an airstrike on their location. But that would mean certain death for anyone caught in the open. Do you know what Sergeant Martinez did then? Quote, no one in the room dared to speak. She called in the airstrike herself, while still performing surgery on her dying friend, with enemy fighters less than 50 yards away. She provided target coordinates for bombs that would impact within 20 meters of her position. She essentially called in an airstrike on herself to prevent the Taliban from capturing wounded American soldiers. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face now, but she didn't try to hide them. For years, she had carried the weight of that day alone, had relived every decision and questioned every choice she had made. The airstrike worked, Morrison said quietly. The Taliban advance was stopped, and additional support arrived to secure the area. But Sergeant Martinez's friend died in her arms 15 minutes later. Despite everything she had done to save him, Morrison turned to face the committee directly. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what real service looks like. That is what earned Sergeant Martinez the Medal of Honor, the highest recognition for valor that this nation can bestow. And you people had the unmitigated arrogance to question whether she had earned the right to be in this room. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of Hayes beginning to sob. The weight of what he had done, the magnitude of his ignorance and cruelty, had finally penetrated his consciousness. "General," he said through his tears, "how can we possibly make this right? How do we apologize for something like this?" Morrison's expression remained stern. "You don't apologize to me, Councilman. You apologize to Sergeant Martinez. But understand this, an apology doesn't undo what happened here today. An apology doesn't erase the humiliation you subjected a genuine American hero to. An apology is just the first step in a very long process of making amends." Sarah, who had been listening to Morrison's account in stunned silence, finally stepped forward. When she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "Councilman Hayes, Mrs. Winters, all of you," she said, looking around the table. "I don't want your apologies, if they're just because you found out about my military record. What you did to me today was wrong, but it wasn't wrong because I'm a Medal of Honor recipient. It was wrong because you assumed you had the right to humiliate and judge someone based on their appearance and their job." Margaret looked up through her tears. "Sarah, please. We're so sorry. We had no idea, but that's exactly the point," Sarah said firmly. "You had no idea. But you acted anyway. You made assumptions about my worth as a person based on nothing but the fact that I clean floors for a living. What if I hadn't been a veteran? What if I was just a single mother working hard to provide for her family? Would that have made your actions any less cruel?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Morrison nodded approvingly. "Sergeant Martinez raises an important point. The issue here isn't just about respecting veterans. It's about basic human dignity and the dangerous assumptions we make about people based on their circumstances." Hayes wiped his eyes and looked directly at Sarah. "You're absolutely right. And I'm ashamed of my behavior, not just because of your service, but because I treated another human being with such disrespect. I pride myself on being a public servant, but today, I was just a bully with a title." One by one, the other committee members began to speak up, offering genuine apologies and expressing their horror at what had transpired. But Sarah could see that the damage had been done, not just to her, but to their own understanding of themselves and their prejudices. Morrison watched the proceedings with satisfaction, but he wasn't finished yet. "There's one more thing," he announced. "The organizing committee for tonight's Veterans Day ceremony has been looking for a keynote speaker. I can't think of anyone more qualified than Sergeant Martinez to address the community about what service really means." Sarah's eyes widened in alarm. "General, I told you I can't." "You can," Morrison said firmly. "And you should. This community needs to hear your story. Not just about Hill 394, but about the quiet heroism of coming home and rebuilding your life. They need to understand that veterans don't all look the same, and that service doesn't end when you take off the uniform." Hayes leaned forward eagerly. "Please, Sarah. Sergeant Martinez, would you consider speaking tonight? It would be an honor to have you address the ceremony." Sarah looked around the room at the faces of people who, just an hour earlier, had been her accusers and tormentors. Now they looked at her with something approaching reverence, but she wasn't sure that was any better than their earlier contempt. "I'm not a public speaker," she said quietly. "I'm not comfortable being the center of attention. I just want to live quietly and raise my daughter." Morrison's expression softened. "I understand that, Sarah. But sometimes we have obligations that go beyond our comfort zones. How many young veterans are out there right now, struggling to find their place in civilian society? Feeling invisible and forgotten. How many could benefit from seeing that someone like them, someone who has faced the same challenges, can still have value and dignity?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. She thought about Emma and what kind of world she wanted her daughter to inherit. She thought about other veterans who might be facing the same humiliation she had endured today. And she thought about the soldiers whose names were tattooed on her back, who would never have the chance to tell their own stories. "If I do this," she said finally, "I want to speak about more than just my military service. I want to talk about the assumptions we make about people, about the danger of judging worth based on appearance or circumstances. I want to talk about the invisible veterans who are all around us, working regular jobs and living quiet lives." "That would be perfect," Morrison said with a smile. Hayes stood up and extended his hand to Sarah. "Sergeant Martinez, would you allow me the honor of introducing you properly at tonight's ceremony?" Sarah looked at his outstretched hand for a moment, then reached out and shook it firmly. "You can call me Sarah," she said. "And yes, I'll speak tonight. But I have one condition. Anything. I want to keep my cleaning job. This doesn't change who I am or what I do for a living. I'm still the same person I was this morning, and I'm proud of the work I do here." Morrison nodded approvingly. "Spoken like a true soldier. Service doesn't make you better than anyone else, but it doesn't make you less either." As the committee began to disperse to prepare for the evening ceremony, Sarah found herself alone with Morrison in the conference room. The general had been watching her carefully throughout the confrontation, and she could see that he had something more to say. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I need you to know that what happened here today, as painful as it was, might be exactly what needed to happen." "What do you mean?" "You've been hiding for too long. Your story, your example, your voice, they're needed. Tonight is just the beginning. There are opportunities for you to make a real difference, to help other veterans, to educate people about what service really means." Sarah shook her head. "General, I'm not looking for a new career. I just want to go back to my normal life." "I understand that," Morrison said. "But sometimes our normal lives aren't enough. Sometimes we're called to something larger." As they walked out of the conference room together, Sarah felt a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite sort through. The humiliation of the morning had been transformed into something like vindication, but she wasn't sure that felt any better. She was still the same person who had walked into that room hours earlier. But somehow, everything had changed. That evening, as Sarah stood at the podium looking out at an audience of hundreds of veterans and their families, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had once crawled into burning vehicles to save soldiers was now standing in front of a microphone, preparing to save something else. The understanding that heroism comes in many forms, and that the most important battles are often fought not with weapons, but with compassion, dignity, and the courage to see beyond our assumptions. Her speech that night would be remembered for years to come, not just for what she said about her military service, but for what she said about the service that continues long after the uniform comes off. And in the audience, Councilman Hayes and Margaret Winters would sit with tears in their eyes, finally beginning to understand the true cost of their ignorance and the true meaning of the word service. The story of Sarah Martinez would spread far beyond that small community, becoming a reminder that heroes walk among us every day, often invisible and unrecognized, cleaning our floors and serving our communities with the same quiet dignity they once brought to serving their country. And sometimes, if we're very unlucky, we humiliate them in conference rooms, but sometimes, if we're very fortunate, a general walks in at just the right moment to remind us that the worth of a person isn't determined by their job title, but by the content of their character and the service in their heart.